So yeah, thanks for attending the webinar. We'll be covering top 10 things that you should be doing in Azure. My name's Robert Thomas. I'm Head of Managed Services here at Valto, and I'm also joined by my colleague today, Will Jones, who's also a Senior Cloud Consultant. Okay, so obviously agenda. So the 10 things we'll be covering that we should be doing in Azure. We'll be going into some of the details there. We'll also have a very quick look at Valto Services, and then there'll be a Q&A session at the end. So any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat, and then we'll go through that at the end of the webinar session. Okay, over to you, Will.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, my name's Will. So yeah, we're going to start off with the first slide, multi-factor authentication. Obviously, MFA has been around for quite a while now, but it's still quite amazing to see the amount of companies which don't currently enforce some level of MFA. At the very least, we recommend you protect the administrating roles, so the global admins or any accounts which have some sort of administrative access. Ideally, MFA should have been enabled for all users, but if you're still just starting this process, at least make sure all of your admins are protected. So we can incorporate MFA with conditional access, which then gives us kind of if and then statements. So we can skip MFA if the source is coming from a trusted location like the office, or we can force the MFA if somebody's access on an unmanaged device, or we can use risky sign-ins to detect if credentials have been found in public, or any malware has been detected on the machine. So we can enforce MFA at all those points. It gives you a bit more granular control. We always recommend implementing strong authentication methods. So recently Microsoft have started pushing passwordless sign-in. So using the Authenticator app, instead of just using your traditional password, excuse me, we can use a code from the app, which is something which Microsoft are pushing quite heavily at the moment. We also recommend that you enable self-service password resets. So there is a few extra pieces which are needed, especially if you're using an on-premise domain controller. So there are some pieces that need to be put in place before that. We always recommend you regularly review the MFA usage. So Entra's got quite a comprehensive portal showing all of the MFA registrations and the methods which your users are using. So it's always good to keep on top of that, especially if you're using conditional access where you may be skipping MFA if they're in the office or on a trusted device. So if those things are in place, then you've just got to be aware that the users may not have ever been prompted to set it up. So constantly check, make sure that everybody's up to date, and everybody's got an authentication method registered in their account. It's also really important to educate users. So if you're at the start of the MFA journey, some users may kick back to say they don't want to be maybe using personal phones or entering phone numbers. So it's good just to sit down, explain the benefits, and often that can sway them their opinion about why it's needed. And finally, we always recommend you have a backup authentication method just in case your primary method is unavailable or you need a new device adding, and at least gives you another option to log in. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Will. So next we're covering Azure Policy. This is kind of a great tool to align the governance across your entire cloud estate in Azure. So Azure Policy allows you to define and enforce rules and standards across either all the management groups. It can drill down to the subscription level and even go down to the resource group as well. So leveraging Azure Policy, you can actually monitor compliance across the environment. So some of these policies can enforce things such as allowed locations for your resources, so you can meet your residency and location requirements for storing customer and business data. We can even define things like allowed resource types. So if the subscription is for hosting and building specific applications, then there's no need to kind of add additional resources to that subscription. That may kind of increase cost, complexity, or maybe even pose security risks if there's no knowledge around that kind of resource. We can do things like requiring like key firewalls on key vaults. We can even define the VM SKU sizes as well. So if there's like a developer subscription, for example, we can only allow a certain set of VM sizes to ensure that we're keeping the cost down. So no one can actually go in there and define a really expensive virtual machine that's going to consume a lot of your cloud credits. One of the best things about this is you can kind of monitor that policy. So you can get alerts when things change within the environment, or you can define some enforcement policies that will actually go on a schedule and apply things like tags to make sure that you've got your taxonomy and all of the resources are tagged properly. And there's a whole host of policies built into the Azure Governance and Compliance Center, or you can actually go ahead and define some of your own as well. One of the easiest ways to deploy policies is to use Azure Blueprints. So we tend to do this a lot across all of our internal subscriptions and across a lot of our customer subscriptions with Azure Lighthouse. We can define our policies in an Azure Blueprint, for example, and then apply that to the customers management group, and that will filter down into managed customer subscriptions, so they're benefiting from all of our recommended governance and compliance policies there as well. Okay, thanks, Will.
Okay, excuse me. So moving on to Azure Secure Score, which is part of the Defender for Cloud offering. So if many of you may have used the Secure Score with Office 365, it's a nice little portal. It's the same sort of thing with Azure. So it'll evaluate all of your resources, and it'll make recommendations on different security controls. So as you can see from the image, it'll scan your image, it'll scan your compute and networking, and Internet of Things, your data and your identity, and make recommendations. So it's important. You'll probably log into it and be overwhelmed by the amount of alerts. So it's good to just address the high priority recommendations, create some sort of roadmap. So maybe don't implement everything at once. Create some sort of roadmap and make sure that you're meeting your targets as you're going through the roadmap to make sure that you're crossing off a few of these vulnerabilities. Constantly check it too, because things change, alerts get added in. So this isn't going to be the same all the time. So you may just, when one day you might log in, there's going to be another recommendation. So always keep an eye on it. Cheers, Rob.
Thanks, Will. Okay, so number 4, cost anomaly alerts. It's always interesting when we speak to customers if they're actually using cost anomaly reports. So they'll use cost analysis in Azure, and they'll obviously download their invoices and get invoices sent from us as well if they're a managed customer. But there's still a lot of people that kind of are not using this feature. So it's a really powerful tool to kind of like monitor and identify any unexpected changes in your Azure resource costs. So that could be an increase or even a decrease as well. So perhaps you're meeting certain service level agreements and the cost of the kind of consumption goes down. That could also trigger an anomaly and also cause for concern and some investigation there as well. So some of the features of the cost anomaly alerts, obviously you'll get the alerts through to a central location. So in the screen on the right hand side, you can see an example of an auto-generated email where there's an unusual cost increase that was detected on a specific date on that subscription, and we can see the delta there as well, how much it's increased. We can also set appropriate thresholds. So if the subscription is not changing very often, or you don't expect it to change, you can kind of assign your thresholds there as well, and do things like defining the alert scope. So depending on which threshold's been met, you can define where the alert actually goes to as well. And then obviously drilling down into the anomaly detection. So it will actually pinpoint the change in resource, where that cost has likely come from, and gives you the power to kind of investigate and analyze these alerts properly as well. They've got collaborate with relevant stakeholders. So when it comes to kind of cloud resources, it's really important to make sure that you're kind of working with the finance team. They obviously like things like capital costs. So with Azure and cloud tending to be kind of a recurring variable cost, it's important to apply some governance here and also keep an eye on those costs as well, and also make sure that you're optimizing your Azure consumption. Other things where we've seen this really kind of help customers. We've heard a few horror stories when we've been in kind of Microsoft events and things of customers whose subscriptions have been hacked. So referring back to MFA, what Will was talking before, that there've been kind of administrator accounts that have been exposed. People have gone into the subscription and fired up some really expensive virtual machines to do things like crypto mining, and that subscription was allowed to run for the entire month. And I think the bill was around £90,000, and of course there was no anomaly detection, there was no MFA, and this particular person's subscription was heavily utilized. And yeah, there isn't really much you can do once you've kind of consumed that amount. I think you'd have to go to Microsoft and really prove that you'd put all of the contingencies in place, and making sure that you're kind of secure and compliant before they'd actually go ahead and do anything and invest those kind of things. So yeah, cost anomaly is really powerful, really easy to set up, and it's something that every administrator should be doing on all of their subscriptions, whether internal or customer facing as well. Thanks, Will.
Okay, yeah, moving on to Azure Advisor. So it's Azure Advisor is quite a powerful cloud service offered by Microsoft. Gives you a nice dashboard, as shown in the picture on the right hand side. It can go through and analyze cost, which is obviously a big one. If it's noticing maybe over or underutilized resources like virtual machines, it can make recommendations on how you can save money and how much money it thinks it will save you over the month as well. So it's really good, really important to be checking it. Security as well, it'll obviously recommend security recommendations, or offer security recommendations. Reliability, so it will check if you've got backups, any disk upgrades may be needed from standard to premium storage, and it'll also check for things like replication to protect your apps from regional outages. Operational excellence, it can help with process and work efficiency, resource management and deployment best practices, and performance, mainly for application or hosting applications. So it can check for, it can offer cache recommendations and capacity utilization issues, and it recommend how to fix those and make things running a bit smoother. Cheers, Rob.
Okay, so number 6, hosting static websites on Azure Storage. So yeah, this is a really quite a neat way of just kind of creating static websites. You completely avoid the complexity of having to spin up a VM with a web server role, or even app service plans, or other types of kind of web hosting, whether it be external to Azure. You can configure things like index and error documents. You can even utilize custom domains. So the actual static site will have an internal Azure.net domain, which you can obviously point with some domain records there as well. We've got things like HTTPS, leveraging Azure Content Distribution Network. So we get kind of all of the really good resilient and features of Microsoft Azure, and obviously access to Microsoft's network. With content distribution, we can kind of host large media files, for example, and sites across different regions across the globe. And it's a really good way of kind of optimizing hosting costs, and also kind of this hooks into Azure GitHub Actions and CI/CD as well, which is really good for updating that content. We've used kind of this in many different instances. So we've used it just to host error pages. If an application or a specific website goes down, we just use the static site for information for customers. We've used it for kind of links in all sorts of online instructions for users. So things like Azure Information Protection, when users are applying sensitivity labels, they get a nice little link to go to a custom branded site. This is just like a static site that's hosted in a storage account. For those who kind of maybe from the AWS world, it's quite similar to hosting sites in an S3 bucket. So it's just a really cost-effective way of just hosting a site, and it's something that's really easy to set up. And there's probably lots of instances when you want to access something over HTTPS and just need a quick way to access that as well. Okay, Will.
Just so more ways to excuse me, more ways to save money or save running costs in Azure. Just starting stopping VMs during off hours, so we can do this using pre-built runbooks in Azure, so we can set the servers to be started and stopped at certain times. Obviously creates massive cost savings. It's important to define off-hour schedules and also consider time zones, especially if you've got resources spread over different regions. And also, if it is something which you're thinking about doing, obviously consider the dependencies, make sure that there's no software relying on any of the servers which you might be turning off, or any backups which might be running, or anything which might be depending on the resource which you're switching off. We can use Azure tags to categorize and group VMs based on their off-hour schedule. So that allows us to define different schedules for different sets of VMs based on their tagging, and provides flexibility and granularity in your automation. We also recommend you use auto shutdown where possible. So there's also a built-in shutdown option on a virtual machine in Azure. It's really handy for when you have a dev environment or you're spinning up test machines. Always make sure that that's turned on, so you're not incurring costs during the evening when you're not using the test environments. And finally, reserved instances. So if you've been running your Azure infrastructure for a certain amount of time and you've noticed maybe over a year you haven't had to increase it or add more storage or add more RAM, then it's probably time to start thinking about reserved instances. And they can go for 1 and 3 years, which locks in the subscription for that amount of time, and often can often give you cost savings of up to 72%, depending on what resource you're going and depending on how long you want to do it. So once you've been running it, once you've been running your infrastructure, give it a review after a year. There might be certain VMs that you might be able to just switch over to the reserved instance, saving you some money. Cheers, Rob.
Okay, number 8, Azure Logic Apps. So these are a really cool kind of infrastructure as a service, or almost platform as a service, I should say, tool built into Azure. So that for those who are familiar with Microsoft 365 and Modern Workplace, they're almost exactly like Power Automate, or Flows as they used to be called. So it's kind of a cloud service that helps you schedule, automate, orchestrate tasks, business processes and workflows when you need to kind of integrate lots of apps and data systems and services across many enterprises or organizations and data centers. So it's kind of a platform as a service based, or serverless if you like. There's tons of pre-built connectors with Logic Apps. So there's all sorts of first-party ones. So the integration into all of the Azure components is there right out of the box. But there's kind of fantastic third-party connectors. You can see on the screen on the right-hand side some of the big names that it supports there as well. It's really good for kind of low-code creation, so you don't need extensive knowledge of coding. It's all kind of graphical and visual workflow tools, and there's also tons of built-in templates in Azure as well, so there's lots of predefined tasks already there. If there's something that you're trying to achieve, just go into kind of the marketplace and you'll see all of the templates there as well. Some of the examples that we kind of use these Logic Apps for is sending alerts and notifications. So when a specific event is triggered, the Logic App will then take that event and then go ahead and do something. So that would be an alert, for example. You can move files between databases and storage. They're fantastic tools for connecting sort of in a hybrid scenario. So on-premise infrastructure connecting to cloud. Going back to the VM stop-start, that Will mentioned before, a lot of that solution can be built on Logic Apps. So you can connect those to Azure Runbooks, which contain schedules, and then those schedules, when they occur, would then obviously fire a response off to the Logic App, which would be waiting for that runbook alert, and that Logic App would go off and then do something like shut down a VM with a specific tag, for example. We also recommend lots of like startup businesses to use logic apps and kind of serverless, kind of moving away from the traditional management VM, where traditionally an enterprise would have a management or a scripting VM that would contain all sorts of different IT tasks and processes and schedules, which is kind of the legacy way of doing things. Obviously, it's a lot more heavy because you've got a whole virtual machine to run. You can kind of save so much more money just by using logic apps, because you only pay for the time that they execute, so like fractions of a second. So we're talking kind of like fractions of pennies to actually run these apps. So yeah, if you're not using them for any kind of automation, I recommend you just kind of start deploying these in a subscription and start trying them out as well. Okay, Will.
Yeah. Yeah, Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, or PIM, something else which is easily available in the Azure portal and something which you should be using. So it helps by protecting all the information and resources from malicious or unauthorized access. There's a few different access levels available, including just-in-time access, where we can start approval workflow processes to only allow access for a certain amount of time or to perform certain tasks. So this allows us to get a full audit trail of privileged activities, which can help you easily identify who or what gained access to what systems and what they did and how long they did it for. We can also create like one-time accounts as well, so created on the fly, and we can get them to be deprovisioned or deleted after use, so it's really quite handy. Rob?
Thanks, Will. Finally, number 10, Azure Virtual Desktop. So formerly known as Windows Virtual Desktop, or WVD. So this is a cloud-based virtual desktop infrastructure service, or VDI. It's kind of a fantastic product because you can basically run Windows apps anywhere. So kind of rather than trying to migrate to a software as a service solution, you can kind of use this as an interim when you need to host legacy apps. You can just deploy these in like multi-session hosts running kind of Windows operating systems. The AVD control plane, so unlike traditional RDS infrastructure, where you've got things like load balancing, connection brokers, and RDS gateways, all that's been taken away and managed internally by Azure. So the only thing that you have to really concentrate on is the management of the session hosts and the identity services, for example, so Azure AD and Active Directory. Another benefit is, so rather than using like Windows Server, which is what the traditional RDS was based on, there are kind of lots of different multi-session hosts now available. So you can use Windows 7, Windows 10, and Windows 11, and you'll find that the users get kind of a much better native desktop experience as opposed to kind of a cut-down server-based operating system. So you'll find that the apps have a lot greater compatibility running in these kind of more native desktop operating system session hosts. There's great integration with Microsoft 365 and Azure AD. So the licensing model, if you've got Microsoft 365 Business Premium, F3, and any of the enterprise SKUs, your users are already licensed to access Windows Virtual Desktop. So you've not got to go ahead and buy some more things like user CALs or device CALs. It's a lot more easier to manage. The only thing that you'll be paying for is the compute time and the storage that you're utilizing in Azure. So you probably find that a lot of your users already have the required Microsoft 365 SKUs. So it's definitely worth creating proof of concepts and investigating Azure Virtual Desktop. Obviously, as opposed to kind of traditional RDS infrastructure, with it being hosted on cloud, you get the full flexibility and scalability for your remote workforce. You can do things like automation with logic apps, as I mentioned before, to scale up the virtual machines and to add more session hosts. There are kind of built-in features now called Connect on Start, where as users start to log in, more session hosts will actually fire up when the host pools get full. So it kind of like takes care of itself, and the automation's built in right out of the box. We see a lot of customers using Azure Virtual Desktop purely for security. So rather than having to kind of manage local devices, complex MDM solutions, and making sure the users are connecting from company devices, you can just kind of enforce any access to business apps, Microsoft 365, SharePoint. They can only access those resources when they log into the VDI solution. So it's really good for like sales. If they've got really sensitive like Power BI dashboards of sales data, they can just log into the secure VDI solution to access them there, so they're not accessing it on their own device. And even really what's more beneficial to the user is they can just access these kind of apps from an iPad or basically any OS, as you can see from the diagram there as well. So yeah, it's a really great kind of product from Azure. 100% recommend even just trialing this out. We've deployed quite a few of these, and yeah, we've had great success with this product. Okay, so those are the top 10 things that we recommend that everyone kind of does in Azure. Yeah, just go and try out some of those things. I'm sure you'll find some useful components there. Just covering some Valto services. Obviously, Microsoft, we've got certified Microsoft solutions partner, qualified team of consultants and cloud engineers who specialize in Microsoft Cloud IT services. Obviously, Azure consultancy. You can cover kind of all aspects of an Azure project, from support to architecture, implementation, and management of those environments. Just a few open projects, for example, just some things that we're doing in Valto. So we've got some AWS to Azure migrations. So a lot of those are infrastructure as service based, moving things like Oracle DB. Next, we've got Azure Virtual Desktop deployments. So yeah, we're really proficient in designing and building AVD solutions. Something our engineers really love working on. So yeah, we've got a couple of those. Infrastructure as service Azure migration. So this we kind of call lift and shift migrations. So moving virtual machines from sort of private data centers or co-locations straight into Azure, and then doing some things like right sizing off the back of that, and then maybe even moving to platform as a service once those initial migrations and projects have been done. Security assessments and audits. So this is something we do all of the time, especially when we're engaging with new customers. We'll do a security assessment and a full audit, obviously utilizing all of the tools that we've explained today, just to make sure that the customer's environment, they're benefiting from everything within their Azure subscription. Next, we've got some platform as a service app deployment. So we work with a few customers deploying applications into the cloud. Some of those are embedded into Azure DevOps with pipelines, and then supporting builds and some architecture work around there as well. And then subscription migration. So this is something that we do quite a lot of. We quite often take on board customers who've built an extensive cloud environment in Azure, and that's kind of all on a pay-as-you-go subscription. So as a Microsoft partner, we can deploy NCE, so new customer experience subscriptions. You're going to get monthly bills rather than kind of putting everything on a credit card, which can obviously get maxed out, which is a risk, which we see quite a lot of. Credit cards kind of bouncing and then customer subscriptions get paused. So moving over to NCE, that's one of the benefits. As well as kind of moving over subscriptions, will also help right size customer environments. And moving over to NCE, they also benefit from a managed support service as well. So with pay as you go, you obviously have to raise tickets with Microsoft that you'll then charge off the back of it. Having an NCE subscription with a partner like Valto, you get access to all of the obviously all of the experts and services on the left hand side. You can leverage our relationship with Microsoft as well, and we can also raise tickets on your behalf, and there won't be any charge with that service as well, which is really good. So yeah, we tend to do a lot of the subscription migrations. Okay, yeah, and that's everything. If you've got any questions, just feel free to fire them in the chat, and Will and I will do our best to answer those for you. We've got one question that's come through. Can you run Azure automation to on-premise servers? Yeah, so with the automation side of things, you can run hybrid connectors. So based on Logic Apps and Azure Runbooks, you can create a hybrid connector. Then you just simply install an agent on a server or virtual machine that's hosted on premise, and then you can use that as computational resource. So your automation could be running scripts that reference Active Directory, for example. You'd be able to contact the domain controller via the hybrid connector, and yeah, so you can fully utilize automation on premise as well. There's also Azure Arc, which allows you to extend services from Azure onto dedicated on-premise infrastructure, and kind of expand out some of those products onto your own hardware as well. Okay, thanks so much for attending. Have a good day.